Hello, and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 187, Gutenberg's Pressing Matters, which is also episode 3 of season 10, The Empire in the 15th Century. This podcast is now well into its 4th year, and I've established my process for research, script writing, and recording. And as for research, that usually means going to the London Library and bending down to the lowest shelf to dig up some age-old copy of a German language book that happens to be the one and only works that goes into the kind of detail on the topic at hand that you guys have gotten used to. Imagine my confusion when I started looking into Johannes Gutenberg and I found not just a few books, but whole shelves of books in English, German, French, Italian, and dozens more, talking about even the most intricate details of the life and works of the inventor of the printing press. Drowning in this avalanche of material, I realized that at a minimum this story requires 2 episodes. One about how Gutenberg came to achieve this breakthrough, and then the impact his invention had on the world and on the Germans in particular. Hence today's episode is about the man and his invention, though about the man we know so very little. But before we start, just another reminder that the History of the Germans is advertising free, and for good reason. It does not take a genius to notice that the way we communicate as a society has changed. We do spend a lot of time on electronic media of all kinds, not just social media, but podcasts, streaming, YouTube, etc. Most of this content is paid for by advertising. Advertisers, in the absence of better metrics, pay the platforms and creators on the basis of eyeballs or ear canals. And since our crocodile brains are still dominated by the cerebellum, our eyeballs and ear canals always turn to the loudest and the most eye-catching thing. And that is not always the information our frontal cortex wants and should feed on. We need stuff that may be less exciting but more thoughtful. And that is not what advertisers can pay for. So, we need at least a part of our information world that is funded by us, by the users. That is why I have subscriptions to newspapers and libraries, and I'm happy to pay for the BBC and for Netflix for all my sins, and for podcasts and Substacks too. And if you want to do the same and for some reason feel the History of the Germans is deserving your support, go to historyofthegermans.com/support and sign up as a patron. And thanks a lot to Marco P., James Zapf, Kenneth H., Mark V., Mark Young, Swin Purple, and Jeff N., who've already done that. And with that, back to the show. Johannes Gutenberg was born sometime between 1393 and 1400 in Mainz. His family was comparatively well off, part of the 100 ancient families of the city, what we now call a patrician. The family lived mainly off annuities, financial instruments issued by the city that generated a solid and predictable income. We also know that his father was a companion of the mint, meaning he was on some sort of supervisory board of the archiepiscopal mint that struck the Rhenish Gulden, the most common currency in the Holy Roman Empire. His name, Gutenberg, derived, as was customary, from his family home, the Hof zum Gutenberg, in the city centre next to St. Christophorus Church. Gutenberg translates as Hill of the Good People, but that was not its true origin. Where it stood had once been the home of one of the largest Jewish communities in Europe. That community had been subjected to pogroms ever since 1096, as we discussed in episode 38, but the great expulsion of the Jews had come in 1349, when the Black Death struck. Allegedly 6,000 men, women and children chose to commit suicide by setting light to their synagogue rather than convert. Where they once lived, the Judenberg, the Hill of the Jews, was given to the city council, and a patrician family built a house on the site. As memory of the atrocities faded, that house turned from Judenberg to Gutenberg, which in 1419 the family adopted as their family name. And that is all we know about his first 30-plus years. He may have gone to university, he may have trained as a goldsmith, or he may have just hung out in bars and nightclubs. In 1434, he moved to Strasbourg, a city that, at the time, was much larger and much richer than Mainz. Mainz had been going downhill, due to the mismanagement by the city council, internal conflicts, the endless fighting between the archbishops and their neighbors, and the regular schisms between two contenders for the archiepiscopal throne. Even 100 years on, the city had not recovered its population from before the Black Death. Strasbourg, on the other hand, was thriving, reaching 25,000 inhabitants, a major hub of the wine trade that stretched all the way to Norway and Scotland. Its cathedral, one of the greatest achievements of Gothic art, was still rising up, and the streets were lined with impressive stone houses of prosperous merchants and artisans. What Gutenberg did in Strasbourg for the following 10 years is shrouded in mystery. Some argue he did already begin printing there in 1440, but no proof of such activity can be found. All we know about this time is from the court records, according to which he was engaged in the production of mirrors and some adventure and art that was kept secret. He left Strasbourg in 1444, then disappeared from the records before he returned to Mainz in 1448. Seemingly flush with cash, he buys out his siblings and moves into the old family home, zum Gutenberg. And that is where he starts his printing business, for real. In 1454, he published his masterpiece, the Gutenberg Bible. That is it. He never wrote down what inspired him, how he developed the technology, or what he wanted to achieve with it. All these books that have been written about Gutenberg's life, and there are at least 3 available in English, are all conjecture. Well argued and meticulously researched, but in the end more suitable for a true crime than for a history podcast. But what we have is his magnificent innovation, according to Luther, God's ultimate and greatest gift. Johannes Gutenberg stands in a line with the world's greatest inventors, the James Watts, the Thomas Alva Edisons, the Carl Benz and Louis Pasteurs. But as much as we would all love to read the story of the lone genius who had that one brilliant idea that propelled the world forward, we have to acknowledge that boring academic research papers have proven again and again that there are very few, if any, instances where innovations happened that way. All these great advances were usually the culmination of multiple strands of development that came together at a particular time and a particular place to be picked up by some determined individual who happened to be at the right place and at the right time. Let's see whether printing with movable letters was similar. First up, Gutenberg did not invent printing. People have been printing things for hundreds if not thousands of years using wooden stamps. And since the late 14th century, the art of the woodcut was spreading across Europe, a technique that allowed to print images or a page of text multiple times. Gutenberg's technology deviated from woodcut first by using metal rather than wood. Metal is much more durable, allowing the production of a much larger number of copies before the stamps wear out. The second downside of the woodcut was that to create a whole book would require to carve every single page first in wood as a mirror image and then making an imprint. That was not only time-consuming, but also left no room for error. If, say, only one letter was wrong, the whole woodcut had to be made from scratch again, which is why nobody printed books with woodcuts. Gutenberg's press used movable type, so there would be a stamp for each letter, and that would be assembled to form the respective words and sentences. If there was an error, well, all you need to do was replace the letter and restart the printing. That's it, that's all. Genius, isn't that? That's the invention. So let's just go and start printing. Hold on. Let's think about that. If you want to print a book, you will need a lot of these individual letter stamps, called punches. And I mean a lot. For example, in my scripts I use about 3,500 characters per page. The Gutenberg Bible was a bit more generous with space and used only 2,400 characters. But then he printed at least 2 pages on the same sheet of paper. So that means he needed at least 4,800 punches per print run. So let's take a look at how these punches could be made. Punches were originally created in coin making. Up until the modern days, coins were made by creating a metal disc, usually containing some gold, silver or copper. This disk is then struck with a punch to imprint the desired image, say heads or tails, onto that disk, which is why we call it striking a coin. The punch consists of a handle, like that of a chisel, a steel shank of a few centimeters length, into which the punch maker had engraved an image. The coin maker would then carefully place this punch over the metal disc and strike it with a hammer. In a sophisticated mint, such as the mint in mines, there would be another die underneath the disc called an anvil, so that both sides of the coin would be struck at the same time. Now, here's the rub. The anvil lasted about 36,000 strikes and the punch only about 20,000 strikes. A very large mint like Venice would produce about 20,000 coins a day, meaning the punch needed to be replaced every day. Mines were certainly smaller, but still, the punches only functioned for a limited period of time. So every day or every couple of days, a punch maker needed to engrave a new punch. And this punch had to look exactly the same as the previous punch to make sure the coins looked identical. Then the coins were quite small and the images, however, quite intricate. These minute images had to be engraved into a steel punch that had to be heated and cooled several times to harden it, but without making it brittle. Then the engraving had to be done into the steel with steel. There's no way you could get hold of a diamond cutter. So steel was used on steel to scrape off minuscule curls of steel. I have no way of checking this, but according to John Mann's book, The Gutenberg Revolution, a good punch maker could create a letter on a scale of 0.01 millimeters, which is 6 times the resolution of a laser printer. And a punch maker needs about a day to make one punch. So to make our 4,800 punches needed to print the 2 pages would take, 4,800 days, which given feast days and holidays meant it would take one punch maker 20 years to make all the punches needed just for these 2 pages, or 20 punch makers a year. And Gutenberg did neither have 20 years nor the funds to employ 20 punch makers. Plus, each letter would end up being just a tiny bit different. So he needed a more efficient solution to make metal punches. And that solution was the hand mold. Now, I've been warned to try to describe the hand mold. Someone called Joseph Moxton tried 200 years ago, and when his 13-page description was reprinted, the editors wrote in the comments that nobody should try to understand the hand mold by reference to this description. But the idea is roughly the following. You create one punch for each letter. Then you use the punch to create an imprint called the matrix. The matrix is then inserted and fixed at the bottom of the hand mold. And then you pour metal into the mold, which then creates a little rectangular stick with a letter at the top. Repeat again and again, and hey presto, one punch is turned into lots and lots and lots of cloned punches. But there was still a problem. If you were to make these from, say, steel, it would take a few hours to cool naturally, or you could cool it down rapidly using water or oil, which would add another step in the process, and also change the chemistry of the metal. Which gets us to the next bit of alchemy, the metal he used for these cloned punches. It was an amalgam of lead, tin, and antimony. This alloy has a habit of cooling extremely quickly. So you can pour in the molten metal that was heated to 327 degrees Celsius and take out the new punch almost immediately, already cool enough to be handled. And bang, you take out the letter punch and then you can use the hand mold again and make the next and the next and the next and the next. Okay, great. Now you can make lots and lots of the 24 or 26 letters of the alphabet. But there's another problem. Gutenberg wanted to create a print that looked like a handwritten manuscript, just better. And that meant he needed a lot more than the 26 types. There were various special signs that were used in abbreviations in the handwritten manuscripts at the time, so he needed these. And he wanted the flow from one letter to the next, again, like in a handwritten manuscript, which meant having to create multiple versions of each letter, with different attachment points. In the end, his typeface had between 220 and 290 different characters, all of which had to be cut into a punch and then molded dozens if not hundreds of times. Great. Now you have a pile of letter punches, but how do you turn this into a page of text? You need to fix them into something. Gutenberg's solution was to create a frame into which the typesetter would place the individual letters. That sounds straightforward, but let's think again. First up, not all sentences are the same length, whilst the frame is rectangular. Well, you can fill the gaps with punches that have no letters on them, effectively creating a void. Or you could create various versions of the same letter with just marginally larger or smaller width to end up with a perfectly justified edge to the text. And finally, you could play around with little fillers to widen the gap between the different letters, and all that has to be done in a way that does not make the text jerky, but flowing naturally, easy to read. And then you have to make sure that all the letters are absolutely 100% the same height. If not, you end up with one letter being bold and the next one faint. And we're talking about precision in the sub-millimeter level. So, now you've got your frame with all the letters firmly held in place, something called a form. The next question is what materials you want to print on. The traditional material to write on in the Middle Ages was vellum, made from calfskin. One calfskin produced about 3 pages of the highest quality, or 6 pages if stretched out. It was fairly easy to print on. But if printing was to become as widespread as it did, it needed another, a cheaper material. Paper had been around in Western Europe since the 11th century as it spread from China via the Islamic world. But in Europe, large-scale production only began in the 14th century. One reason was that Chinese paper was fairly soft and absorbent, perfectly suited for Chinese calligraphy, but not ideal for illuminated manuscripts. The Europeans added animal glue to the mix which hardened it so that it could take ink and paint. The first German paper mill opened in 1390 in Nuremberg, but the most desirable paper came from Italy. The next question was what ink to use. Handwritten manuscripts were written using iron gall ink, a black or brown mixture made from iron sulfate, tannic acid and gum arabicum. This ink was far too watery. It ran off the types and smeared all over the pages. It was also acidic, so often faded through the paper to the opposite side. Gutenberg therefore had to develop a new kind of ink that, since he wanted his books to look like manuscripts, had to have a similar color to iron gall ink, but was more viscous and sticky. Printer's ink was based on oil paint, a material only recently made popular by the early Netherlandish painters, the Jan van Eycks, the Roger van der Weydens and Robert Campins. During the 1440s and 1450s, this technique was gradually coming up the Rhine River, finding an important center in Alsace. In all likelihood, it was there, in the workshops of one of these pioneers of oil painting, that Gutenberg first encountered oil-based paint, without which printing with movable type was simply impossible. Which then reverts back to another problem. The paper that had been used for illuminated manuscripts was a bit too hard for this new ink. So in order to make the printing ink stick, the paper had to be softened, made a little bit moist, which again you need to play around with moisture and ink in order to make it match. At which point we now get to the last major technological component, the actual printing press. Woodcuts and other prints had been made by rubbing paper over the carved piece. That did work to a degree, but often left smudges of paint on the page. And Gutenberg needed to print both sides of the page, which meant he needed to fix the paper in exactly the same place twice. Which means he needed a way to fix both the frames with all the letters and the paper into place and then apply exactly the accurate level of force onto it. The solution for that was the wine press. Mainz is in the midst of a wine-growing region. The Gutenberg family owned a farm near Eltville, right in the center of the Rheingau, source of some of Germany's finest white wines. Wine presses work with horizontal screws and are calibrated to exert exactly the right amount of pressure to squeeze the liquid out of the grapes, but not to smash them into pulp. Ideal for printing, where again precision was key. That is the hardware, the letter types molded in the hand mold, the frame they are fixed in, called the form, the ink, the moistened paper, and the printing press. But that still does not make a book. We need a process. The first step is to carve the type, a job usually done by a gold or silversmith, ideally one with experience working in making coin punches. Then we have someone making the types by punching the matrix, fixing it inside the hand mold, first creating the special alloy and then pouring it into the mold. Once we have the typefaces, they go to the setter, who puts together the actual text by placing the respective letters inside the frame. He or she would usually have arranged the punches in two cases, one for the larger and one for the smaller letters, where we get our terms uppercase and lowercase from. This is a truly sophisticated job. For one, all the letters the setter sees are mirror image. And then he or she has to work out all the gaps and widths to fit the text onto the frame. The frame is then taken to make a first sample imprint, which is given to the corrector. That person will read through the first imprint and check for errors. This is again hugely important, because the advantage of printing over handwritten manuscripts was not only cost, but even more accuracy. Copyists had made mistakes, and these mistakes had then compounded through the line of distribution from one writer to the next. A printed copy was exactly the same as the next one, making sure that only the accurate information is transmitted. But for that, the information had to be accurate to start with, hence the corrector. Once approved, the form then goes to the actual printer. Each printing press is operated by two people. One handles the forms and applies the ink. Application was done with two large leather balls, which are covered with a film of oil paint and then banked vertically onto the form. You do not want to rub it side to side, because it would seep in between the letters and smear across the page. Doing that meant the banger often got sticky oil paint onto his fingers. That was difficult to wash off. Hence you needed another person to handle the clean sheets of paper. The paper needed to be a bit moist to better absorb the paint, which was one part of the job. Then he had to fix it in place on the paper holder, then lower it over the form. And finally he slid the form and paper under the press, turned the screw, released it and slid everything back out. I put a link in the show notes for a video where you can see how that worked. Then the paper and paint needed to dry, which meant it was brought up to the loft where it was hung up like washing. And then the whole process was repeated to print the back of the page. And to make sure that the back and the front aligned perfectly, the paper frame had two little pins that pricked the paper. When it came back down, having dried in the loft, you put the paper through the same pricks when fixing it, and hey presto, perfection. I hope you get what I'm telling you here. The invention of printing was not some eureka moment when Gutenberg jumped up in his bathtub and went, "Ha! That is how it works." This was likely a decades-long process of trial and error, developing each one of these specific instruments, the hand mold, the form, the ink, the paper, the printing press, and then going through hundreds or thousands of iterations to figure out which combination of materials and pressure worked best. Since Gutenberg left no record of his life apart from the legal documents, we do not know how many iterations he went through. But to give you an idea, James Dyson went through 5,127 prototypes of his bagless vacuum cleaner before he finally released DC-01, the product that would make him a billionaire. Elon Musk, as you know, not my favorite person, took 6 years before his rockets first reached orbit, after several exploded, and that was based on a technology that had already existed since the 1940s. The first reusable rocket, his true innovation, took another 7 years to develop. In other words, innovation is 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. That was the case in the 15th century, and that is still the case today. It is also most unlikely Gutenberg did develop each of these tools and processes all by himself. Even if he had some goldsmith skills, for which there is no evidence, it is unlikely he could operate at the level of precision required to make the punches. We know he hired a goldsmith, Hans Dunne, in Strasbourg and kept him on when he moved to Mainz. As for all the other tools, let's remember that from his days in Strasbourg onwards, he had a team of 6 to 8 people working with him, many great artisans in their own right, and staying with him throughout. And then we have the time and place. Mainz and Strasbourg in the first half of the 15th century. Both cities lay on the Rhine River, at the time the trading superhighway connecting north and south. There was a mint in Mainz, and with it the specialist skills to make high-precision punches. And Gutenberg knew about those, given his father had been one of the board members of the mint. It was right around that time that oil painting spread southwards along the Rhine from Flanders to Alsace and then Italy. Paper had gained popularity and was making the same journey in the opposite direction. And Mainz lay in the winemaking region with wine presses galore. Now it's unlikely that Mainz in 1450 was the only place in the world where printing with movable type could have been invented, in large part because it was actually invented a few decades earlier in Korea, and other forms of printing had been used in China for centuries. But what movable type printing did in the 1450s in Mainz was to catch on, which is something it did not do in Korea, and that had to do with 2 crucial elements every innovation needs: funding and willing customers. If you look back at the history of Silicon Valley, it's quite obvious that this outburst of innovation and creativity did not come out of nothing. It was a combination of Pentagon, mainly Navy-funded research in Northern California, Stanford University, and then, starting in 1972, venture capital firms providing the funding for all that makes up our modern world, including that pinnacle of technological and creative achievement, podcasts. Gutenberg, too, was dependent upon financial backers. He found a first group of them when he moved to Strasbourg in 1434. He himself had about 350 gulden, enough to buy a substantial house, but not enough to create a business on the scale we were talking about here. So he invited 3 partners to join him. And at that point he did not invite them to join into decades-long chase to develop the printing press. The idea he brought to them was to make mirrors. Not posh glass mirrors, but small handheld mirrors. How do you get rich with mirrors? Well, that is something that could only have worked in the madness of the 15th century. The Black Death and the recurring outbreaks of the plague, the huge uncertainty caused by endless feuds, the absence of a central authority, the split of the church during the schism, the Hussite revolt, the threat of the Turkish invasion, all that left people utterly unsettled. They sought refuge in their faith, and in particular in the support their hope saintly interventions could bring. That is a century of enormous pilgrimages, and one of the most significant ones was the pilgrimage to Aachen. Aachen Cathedral does not only hold the bones of Charlemagne, a saint at least in the eyes of many, but some of the most revered of relics that had touched Jesus himself and members of his family. These include the robe of the Virgin Mary, the swaddling clothes of the infant Jesus, the cloth in which the head of John the Baptist was wrapped, and the loincloth worn by Christ on the cross. Touching these sacred relics would transfer so much holiness, any illness, sadness, and affliction would instantly dissolve. Every 7 years, these saintly objects would be taken outside the cathedral and shown to the people. Each of these 10 days when these displays were done would see 10,000 pilgrims descending on Aachen, trying to catch a glimpse of Jesus' loincloth. No way the canons would allow anyone to touch those precious objects, but they were so imbued with sanctity, they radiated goodness. So simply being in the presence and catching some of those rays would bring salvation from any troubles. But even though Aachen may see 100,000 visitors over these 10 days of the festival, this is not enough to satisfy the demand. All those who stayed home, be it due to lack of funds or illness, were in dire need of deliverance. And there was a way to collect these rays of holiness and bring them back home to your loved ones. All you needed was a hand mirror, that would capture the rays emanating from the sacred relic and then contain them. And these were the kinds of mirrors that Johannes Gutenberg intended to produce. And now take a breath. Guess how many mirrors he intended to make? 500? 1,000? 10,000? No, 32,000 was the intended production run. Selling those at half a guilder each would bring in revenues of 16,000 guilders. Production costs were, hold on, 600 guilders. A gross profit margin of 96% or a profit of 26 times. That is more than, say, Facebook or Google search, albeit not by that much. Just to put all this into perspective, Gutenberg's income was about 30 guilders and his net worth was about 300 guilders. Now, we do not know how Gutenberg intended to make these magic mirrors. In particular, we do not know how he would produce them in such quantities. What we did find, though, was investors who were willing to support this venture with what turned out to be a lot more than 600 guilders. At which point we hit on one of the greatest Gutenberg mysteries. What was it he actually did during his years in Strasbourg? Sure, there were the mirrors, but his partners and he himself poured a lot more than the initially intended 600 guilders into this venture. And then there is the court case, because, surprise, surprise, the scheme did not work out quite as planned. There was a court case at the end of it where the son of one of the partners demanded his father's money back. And what is weird about this court case is that no one, not the claimant, not the witnesses, and certainly not the defendant Gutenberg, was prepared to explain what exactly the venture was. They talk about an Aventur und Kunst, best translated as a venture and an art. And then they go on about presses and forms and secret arts. Something else, beyond the making of mirrors, had been going on. Given all we heard about the complexity of printing and all the different technologies and processes that had to be developed, it's fair to assume that much of the money intended to make mirrors went into the R&D of printing. And then there's the fact that when he arrived in Mainz in 1348, he immediately set out to print things using his printing press. Having left Strasbourg and his old business partners behind, what he now needed was financing to scale up his business. And he found this financing from a man called Johann Fust. Fust was an important citizen of Mainz and a very wealthy man. He lent Gutenberg 800 gulden in 1449 to set up a printing workshop and would provide funding over the next 5 years to the tune of 4,500 gulden, the same as 12 substantial houses in the city. So, everything's now in place. Gutenberg has a technology and a process. He had brought along some members of his old team from Strasbourg and he had hired more. And he had financing. All he now needed was customers. Who would want to own a printed book or any printed material? What he had going for him was a veritable explosion in literacy during the previous 100 years. Knowledge was no longer confined to within the walls of monasteries. By 1440, the German lands boasted 9 universities, up from none in 1370. Running a trading business had become more and more reliant on writing, on the exchange of letters and the drafting of contracts. Hence the sons and sometimes the daughters of the city merchants went to the newly opened schools. And even artisans and labourers, keen to expand their horizons, learned to read. And what did they read? Manuscripts. Along with the growth in literacy, a whole industry of scribes had developed. Paper had been the killer application. Costing a tenth of vellum and parchment, the material itself had become accessible. Entrepreneurs set up writing businesses where scribes would copy books, pamphlets, missals, and breviers by the dozen. In other words, books were accessible. But these handwritten books and documents had a serious weakness. They were written in haste and hence prone to errors. And for some books, errors were unacceptable. A copy of a major theological treatise must not carry mistakes. Imagine what happened if you misinterpret St. Augustine. Same goes even more for missals, the books that lay down in detail how each Mass throughout the year is supposed to be celebrated. Any error there, and the whole of the congregation may find itself falsely instructed. But even more practical things needed to be accurate, like school books. The most widely used school book in the 15th century was the so-called Donatus, a 4th century Latin grammar, a concise book aimed at young students. Again, it is self-evident that a student buying this book would be very badly served did he pick up a version with lots of errors. So, this is how the history of printing begins, with a school book. The Donatus by Gutenberg probably came out in 1450 and remained a mainstay of his workshop throughout. Another line of business came out of the political situation. The Ottomans kept progressing up the Balkans, whilst at the same time threatening Cyprus and Constantinople. Pope Nicholas V called for a crusade and to fund the endeavour offered full indulgences against generous pay. Now, indulgences were not only spiritual offers, but they were also physical objects. About 1 page of dense text recording the exact wording of the papal bull granting the indulgence, its conditions and application. It also featured, of course, the name of the sinner, the name of the priest granting the indulgence, and his signature on the receipt. These pieces of paper could be presented at the next confession and led to automatic absolution of sins and reduction of time in purgatory. Again, this was not a document where spelling mistakes or worse, the omission of whole lines of text was acceptable. Coming to the rescue, Johannes Gutenberg and his printing press. Hence, the second key output of the printing press were forms for indulgences, faithfully recording the papal bull, leaving space to add the names of the sinner and the priest and the signature. Other products were more for daily use. One was the so-called Turk calendar, a calendar for the year with woodcuts and statements encouraging the reader to take up arms against the Turks, or even better, give money to those who wanted to fight. I will not go into one other product, the so-called Sibylline prophecies that he may or may not have printed and what they meant. That is the kind of rabbit hole that has swallowed many a Gutenberg scholar. So far, so seriously underwhelming. School books, calendars, indulgences, clearly not the kind of output that propels one to the European pantheon of greats. What Gutenberg needed was a bestseller, a book that would display the absolute superiority of his innovative production process and that would hopefully make him a rich man. Talking about rich, the print runs were going well. My cash flow was still a bit tight. The problem was the same that had felled so many innovative companies: payment terms. You see, by the time the first little scholar handed over his 2 shillings for the Donatus, Gutenberg had already paid all his suppliers of paper, metal and ink, his employees, his rent and the interest on his loans. And as demand for his print runs went up, so did his upfront expenditure, meaning he had a thriving business, but every penny that came in went straight out the door to pay for more materials and for the next print run. And that meant he did not have the money to make that one killer app, that kind of book that would divide the world history into before and after. So he went back to Johann Fust and asked for another loan. A loan needed to set up another, a second print workshop where he could produce that one killer app. But what was it? Initially, he wanted to piggyback on an initiative to issue a revised missal for the whole of the enormous Archdiocese of Mainz and all its suffragan bishoprics. If that had gone through, it would have been a goldmine. Gutenberg's printing press was the only device that could guarantee that every single copy of the missal, which contains all the rules about how a mass should be done, was identical. And every one of the thousands of parishes in the diocese would have needed to buy one. But it did not come off. Both the Archbishop and the Roman Curia had sponsored the development of missals, and neither could force the other to sanction their product. So, no missal was agreed between the authorities, and betting on one of the drafts winning out in the end would have been utter madness. Exhausted with waiting for the missal, in 1452, Gutenberg decided to go for the big one, for the whole Bible. To get an idea of the scale of the undertaking, the Gutenberg Bible comprised 1,275 pages of text, mostly in 42 lines. It was produced in an edition of 180 copies, some of them on vellum, but mostly on paper. Not any odd paper, but special, expensive Italian paper. It was not just an accurate copy of the, at the time, most accurate copy of the Vulgata, the Latin Bible. It was also, and still remains, one of the most beautiful books ever printed. Each letter comes out as sharp and as accurate as humanly possible. The entire text in 2 columns is justified on the end, requiring an incredibly fiddly adjustment of individual letters until they match. In 1455, probably Fust, not Gutenberg, brought the Bible to the Frankfurt Fair, then and now the greatest trade fair in the German lands, and already at the time it had a section dedicated to books. And who would come to poke around the latest issues than our friend, legendary composer of best-selling erotica and future Pope Pius II, Silvio Aeneas Piccolomini. And he got very excited. So excited he immediately wrote back to his then boss, the Spanish Cardinal de Carvajal, quote, "I did not see complete Bibles, but quinternions, those 5-sheet 20-page sections, of different books, written in extremely elegant and correct letter, without error, which your eminence could read with no difficulty, and without glasses." End quote. Piccolomini tried to buy a copy, but was told that all the copies had already been pre-ordered. Gutenberg had his bestseller. He had produced a book that was not cheaper than a manuscript, but infinitely better. Its letter sharper, its layout more beautiful, and most importantly, error-free. Gutenberg stood on the verge of becoming immensely rich and celebrated as the man who invented the world's most important new technology for 1,000 years. But as he stood there, Johann Fust pulled the rug from under his feet. Gutenberg had never paid any of the interest he owed on all these various loans he had taken out, and right now in 1455, when the Bibles were almost completed but not sold for cash, he had no money, not a penny to rub between his fingers, just debt. Sure, he knew that as soon as he dispatched the books, the funds, maybe as much as 9,000 gulden, would be flooding in. But right now, he did not have a penny. And Johann Fust knew that too. He sued Gutenberg. Gutenberg was forced to hand over both his workshops with all the presses, the nearly finished Bibles, the materials, and everything else he had worked on for nearly 2 decades. Johann Fust and his son-in-law, Gutenberg's former assistant Peter Schaffer, sold the Bibles, made a fortune, continued the workshop, and rapidly became the largest printing business in the Rhineland, publishing books almost as magnificent as the Gutenberg Bible. Gutenberg himself kept going on a smaller scale, but would never have the resources to ever produce anything on the level of the Gutenberg Bible again. And that is where we'll stop for today. Next week I will try to assess the impact of Gutenberg's invention, a task that has defeated many a better man, but, like Gutenberg, I have embarked on this path and I cannot stop. And as usual, my closing plea to support the show at historyofthegermans.com/support. All your help is very much appreciated.